the early morning hours off the US East Coast, and a big passenger ship glides quietly through a murky, all-engulfing fog. Lit from stem to stern like a floating town, the liner has a single funnel which belches smoke as the ship gropes its way ahead blindly. But then, from out of nowhere, comes the chisel-like bow of another ship. It bears down with unstoppable momentum out of the mist, and then comes a shuddering blow. The stranger has buried its bow deep inside the hull of the big passenger ship, opening its side up to the ocean. Water surges in. The passenger ship wallows. A timer has been started, and soon this big liner will be in its grave on the bottom. When we think of the White Star Line and sinking ships, one name springs immediately to mind: Titanic. After that, of course, Britannic is probably the most infamous of the White Star Line's lost liners, despite the fact she sank as a hospital ship. But, in the early morning hours of the 23rd of January 1909, 2 months before Titanic's keel was even laid down, the White Star Line's RMS Republic was struck by the Lloyd Italiano liner SS Florida in a dense fog off the coast of Massachusetts. By the evening of the 24th, Republic had slipped below the inky waters off the coast of Nantucket Island to rest in some 270 feet of water. But, despite carrying 461 passengers and 297 crew, only 3 of the souls aboard Republic died as a result of the collision. At the time of her loss, the 14,400 gross registered ton liner was the largest to ever sink, and the well-coordinated response from other ships in her immediate vicinity cemented the idea that the busy shipping lanes of the North Atlantic would be crowded with enough vessels to ferry passengers and crew from a sinking ship to safety with ease. This confidence was proven to be fatally flawed on the evening of April 15th, 1912, when RMS Titanic sank into the icy waters of the North Atlantic, with no ships close enough to rescue all of her passengers. Beyond that, Republic's sinking has inspired treasure hunters tempted by the spoils of lost riches in the ship's cargo holds. From a US Navy payroll intended for those serving in Gibraltar, to millions of dollars worth of gold for the Russian Tsar, stories of billions of dollars worth of treasure hidden in the decaying hull of the Republic range from the plausible to the fanciful. Even without the prospect of glittering millions, the sinking of RMS Republic was one of the most dramatic maritime disasters of the Edwardian Age, one from which all the wrong lessons were learned. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the true story of the sinking of the RMS Republic, the ship that in some ways would go on to doom Titanic. Built by Harland & Wolff for the Dominion Line, Republic was initially known as the SS Columbus. She was launched in September 1903. Back then, Dominion Line was something of a sister company of the White Star Line, with both companies owned by JP Morgan's massive International Mercantile Marine Company. SS Columbus made her maiden voyage from Liverpool to Boston on the 1st of October 1903, and after just 2 voyages, she was transferred from Dominion over to the White Star and renamed Republic. Republic was an elegant, single-funnel, 4-masted ship, and she was intended to serve as the flagship of the White Star Line's Liverpool to Boston route. While she wasn't anywhere near the giants that would ply the North Atlantic in the decades after her construction, she wasn't exactly a small liner either, coming in at around 15,400 gross registered tons, 570 feet long, with a beam just under 68 feet. She carried her passengers across 5 decks. Her propulsion was conventional for a liner of the early 1900s. Twin screws driven by 2 massive quadruple expansion steam engines. Like so many of Harland & Wolff's ships, she was at the cutting edge of maritime technology for the time, with 12 watertight compartments, a double bottom. She was, for all intents and purposes, an exceptionally safe ship. To bolster those safety credentials, by 1909, Republic had been fitted with a Marconi wireless set, and this would prove to be a vital asset in the near future. Like most large liners of her day, Republic's passengers were divided into 3 segregated classes. She could carry up to 280 in first class, 250 in second, and an astonishing 2,300 in third class, giving a total passenger capacity of 2,830 souls, far more than one of the future Olympic-class liners. Her crew was 300 strong, from stokers in the boiler rooms to stewards in her passenger areas. If Republic's passengers and crew ever needed to evacuate the ship, they were provided with 16 boats. Definitely not enough to carry everyone on board. As we know, with Titanic, it was common, really normal, for ships to carry fewer lifeboats than necessary to actually fit everybody on board back then, but instead it was thought that passengers would be ferried from a sinking ship to a rescue ship over multiple return trips. Lifeboat requirements were dictated by a ship's tonnage, rather than her passenger capacity, and until the sinking of Titanic, legislation hadn't been seriously questioned or challenged. Watertight bulkheads were thought to dramatically slow flooding or stop sinking altogether, and North Atlantic shipping lanes were incredibly busy, so there would be no shortage of rescue ships, it was thought. This would be put to the test by Republic in 1909. In service, Republic became known as the millionaire's ship, owing to the large numbers of wealthy Americans who regularly sailed on her. She was, in first class, lavishly appointed, with rich woodwork and elegant staterooms for first-class passengers. Her dining saloon was particularly fine, able to seat 200 diners in one sitting, and crowned with an intricate stained glass dome. Even for second and third-class passengers, Republic offered a standard of accommodation far beyond what was normally afforded on liners on the Liverpool to Boston route. The high standards of passenger accommodation across all classes was something of a White Star Line tradition, aimed to incentivize passengers to choose the company over competitors like Cunard. While her operators had originally intended Republic to operate solely on that Liverpool to Boston route, by 1904 she was also sailing from Boston to Naples and Genoa. By October 1904, Republic had settled into a new schedule, sailing between New York and the Mediterranean ports in autumn and winter, and Liverpool and Boston in the spring and summertime. Her alternating voyage schedules allowed Republic to service a strong migrant trade from Europe into the US, as well as transporting wealthy Americans from bitter North American winters to the milder climes of southern Europe. Friday, the 22nd of January 1909, was a somewhat typical midwinter day in New York City, but the travellers arriving to board the RMS Republic were actually enjoying warmer weather than the city had shivered through for most of the month, with the temperature rising to a positively balmy 11 degrees Celsius, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Republic would be calling on the Azores, Madeira, Genoa, and Naples before returning to New York City. The voyage would carry far fewer passengers than Republic's 2,800 maximum capacity though. Just over 450 would board at New York. Almost all of these travellers were either well-to-do passengers in first class on something of a Mediterranean leisure cruise, or third-class travellers travelling back to the old world. In keeping with her reputation as the millionaire's ship, the voyage was well patronised by wealthy Americans. Bankers, historians, and even European aristocrats had chosen to escape the cold of the North American winter for the warmer weather of southern Europe. None of them could have imagined, though, just how quickly they would be reunited with Lady Liberty and the winds of New York in late January. Republic set off for Europe with essentially a full complement of crew. She was captained by Inman Selby, a stalwart of the White Star Line. He'd been born in Maryport, Cumbria, in England back in 1862. At the age of 10, he migrated to the US with his family. Settling in Vineland, New Jersey, Selby grew up close to the sea, but not right on it. His teenage years saw him taken on as an apprentice with the White Star Line's sailing ships. As he rose through the company's ranks, he travelled the world, serving on vessels that went out to Australia, New Zealand, China, and Europe. In January 1896, he was given the command of his first vessel, the Coptic, sailing between San Francisco, Hong Kong, and Yokohama. Then by January 1909, he'd captained quite a few of White Star Line's ships and was a veteran of the company's Mediterranean service on the Canopic before taking on Republic. That year, he had been the captain of Republic for months, and he was quite familiar with how she handled. Republic pulled away from chilly New York for the final time at 3 p.m, January 22nd, 1909, and she steamed for the busy shipping lanes of the North Atlantic. There was nothing to suggest that this voyage would be any different from the countless others made by Republic, her captain and her crew. Her newly fitted Marconi wireless system was an added layer of security. In the rare event something went wrong, other ships could be quickly alerted to the danger and alter their course and steam to the rescue. As Republic steamed eastward, the Italian liner SS Florida was nearing her destination, New York. She'd crossed the Atlantic on her usual run from Genoa to New York via Palermo. Launched in 1905 in Genoa, Florida was a relatively small liner, coming in at just 5,018 gross registered tons. She was 380 feet long, with a beam of just under 47 feet. But despite being significantly smaller than many single-funnel liners, Florida was handsomely proportioned, with twin funnels. She was primarily a migrant ship, carrying 1,625 passengers, but only 25 of them could travel first class. That voyage, though, she was only carrying 13, and 826 in steerage. For the majority of her passengers, Florida represented something of a new beginning. Just weeks before, only days after Christmas, a huge earthquake had devastated southern Italy and Sicily. The quake originated in the Messina Strait, and an enormous tsunami followed, decimating coastal cities. 40-foot waves devastated homes and livelihoods, and the city of Messina was all but obliterated. 80,000 people had lost their lives. The deadliest earthquake in European history forced thousands of people to relocate, either to other parts of Italy or abroad. Most of Florida's passengers were survivors of the destruction, seeking a new life in America, after their old one was swept into the sea. Under the command of her 29-year-old captain, Angelo Respini, the SS Florida was closing in on the US in the early hours of the 23rd. It's easy to imagine what her passengers must have been feeling, a mixture of excitement and trepidation after the trauma of their experience just a month earlier, but also the opportunity that awaited them in New York. Off the coast of Nantucket, Florida was steaming through a dense fog. With visibility reduced to mere feet, the ship reduced her speed from her usual 14 knots as a precaution. But Republic was there too, making her way through the mist. A large steamer with a schedule to keep, Selby ordered only a modest reduction in his speed. Republic sounded her whistle at regular intervals to inform other ships travelling in the outbound shipping lane of her presence. At the same time, Florida sounded her whistles as well at regular intervals to warn other nearby ships that she was there too. But despite the best efforts of the crews of Republic and Florida to try to avoid any collision, circumstances outside of their control made it inevitable. Long before the days of radar, and with little to no visibility, Republic and Florida had literally no way of knowing either ship was in their path, except for use of their whistles, and in the vast greyness of heavy fog, a ship's whistles can become very deceiving. On the bridge of the Republic, the thick, early morning fog was cut abruptly by the deep bellow of another vessel's whistle. It was 5:47 a.m. Not only was it foggy, but the sun had barely broken over the horizon. Captain Selby and his crew realised quickly how much danger their ship was in. There was an unknown vessel bearing down on Republic's port side. Selby and his crew took immediate action. Republic gave 2 sharp blasts on her whistle to signal the crew's intended action. The engine room received a sudden, full astern order and hastily reversed. At the helm, an order of harder port was given in an attempt to make a starboard or right-hand turn away from the oncoming ship, but unfortunately Florida's course did not change, and as Republic made her starboard shift, her port side became even more exposed than it was. There was nothing for Selby and his crew to do but to hold their breaths and see if their actions had saved their ship. But then, just moments later, Florida struck Republic square on her port side. Piercing her steel plates like a chisel, Florida's bow inflicted an enormous wound in Republic's side from below the waterline to the upper deck. The impact was right along one of the Republic's major watertight bulkheads. In fact, 2 of Republic's sleeping passengers were killed in the impact, and even more were injured. The ship's slow demise had begun. Florida's bow was crumpled from the impact. She was a staggering 30 foot shorter as a result. Her prow now pointed it straight towards the water below. She ricocheted off Republic's side and drifted back into the fog. 3 of her crew members had died. Republic was left in a dire state. Her engine room was flooding quickly, and within minutes, she began to list to one side. Crew in her boiler rooms worked hard to quickly draw the fires in the boilers and avoid any further devastating explosions. Selby and his officers sprung into action to evacuate their ship. With the fires in the boilers being slowed to a stop, the ship had no power. Republic was a sitting duck in dense fog in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Despite the serious danger the ship was facing, though, Republic would take a long time to sink. One passenger later noted that she was foundering at a rate of about a foot an hour. Her watertight compartments would hold out for many hours, and Selby was calm and well prepared in evacuating his passengers. But the White Star Line also had another ace up its sleeve in the form of that newly installed Marconi wireless transmitter. The system meant that Republic wasn't just drifting about in the fog. She didn't have to rely on flares that would be smudged out by the dense mist. She could put out a distress call. There was only one catch. Republic now had no power. The violent impact of Florida's bow woke up Marconi wireless operator Jack Binns abruptly from his sleep. The impact was alarmingly close to his cabin. Had Florida's position been just a few feet further aft when she hit, Binns might have been killed and the all-important wireless destroyed. Jack Binns would prove to be a true hero of the Republic's story. He was born into poverty in a Lincolnshire workhouse in 1884. He showed an interest in telegraphy as a teenager, and by 18 he was working for the British Post Office as an operator. At 21, Binns began his career with the British Marconi Company, and he was posted to the Republic. But little did he know when he joined that company he would play a part in saving over 1,500 lives. He certainly wasn't thinking about heroism on the morning of the 23rd of January 1909. After recovering from the shock of the collision, Binns sprung into action. His cabin was damaged in the collision, and the Republic was without electricity, but Binns was able to get his Marconi set functioning with backup batteries. The batteries were stored in lower decks of the ship, and Binns had to wade through freezing water to get to them. After the struggle of getting those batteries and his equipment working again, Binns was working with a significantly weaker signal than what he normally would when the ship's generators were up and running. Despite the odds seemingly stacked against him, by 6 a.m, the letters CQD had reached Jack Irwin at the Marconi station at Sconset, Nantucket, some 50 miles away. CQD was eventually superseded by SOS. Back then it was recognised as the Maritime Distress Signal. It was made up of two components: CQ, which was understood to indicate that the message was intended for all land and sea-based operators and required immediate attention, and then D, simply meaning distress. Irwin was quick to use his much more powerful signal to convey the Republic's message to nearby ships. The Marconi operators aboard the White Star Line's transatlantic giant, RMS Baltic, intercepted the message. H.J. Tattersall and his assistant, Gilbert Balfour, would stay at their post far beyond what was usually expected for them to help guide their ship through the fog to Republic's aid. All the while, Binns remained in his cabin, freezing cold, all in the hope of saving his stricken ship. While Binns was working in what can only be described as horrendous conditions to save the Republic, the immediate concern of both Captain Selby and Captain Ruspini on the Florida were the passengers of their vessels. Despite the staggering appearance of Florida's downturned bow, she was actually in far better shape than Republic. In spite of the damage she had suffered, it was hoped the Republic could actually be towed back to New York, but it would be a race against the clock. Republic's condition was poor, and with no power, it wasn't safe for passengers to remain aboard. Florida was largely undamaged aside from that crushed bow. Her watertight compartments weren't breached and she wasn't sinking. She was far more seaworthy. Her engines were operational and she had electricity. She was the safest bet for survivors. So at 7 a.m, just an hour after the collision, Florida steamed the short distance back to Republic and prepared to take her passengers and the bulk of her crew aboard. Selby was meanwhile calm amidst the storm. White Star Line had established evacuation procedures, with stewards being trained in getting passengers to the boat deck in an orderly fashion. On Florida, though, things were less calm. Ruspini was forceful in reassuring his unruly and distressed passengers, and tensions would remain high. Selby, meanwhile, was quick in transferring his ship's complement over to the Florida. Florida would be the Republic's passengers' refuge for many hours. The arrangement was undoubtedly stressful for all aboard the wounded Florida, though. She wasn't a particularly large vessel. She had what looked like to be nasty damage and now had hundreds of additional people crowding her decks. To the passengers, it was apparent she was struggling with her ballooned manifest, as well as that flooding in the forward part of her hull. She now sat lower in the water. It made everybody nervous. Back on Republic, Selby remained with his ship. Binns was also still aboard, repeatedly sending messages out to other steamers nearby, as well as land. A skeleton crew served alongside the captain and the Marconi operator. Not that they could do much though, Republic was completely stranded. Her boilers were cold, her engine room flooded, with no electricity or means to fight against any currents. The only consolation for the White Star Liner was the mercifully calm seas. Republic's lifeboats worked to ferry passengers over to the Florida, and by the time they were all aboard, Selby had reached out to the White Star Line's offices in New York via Binns. Captain Selby stressed to his bosses that the loss of life was minimal and that the situation with passengers was under control, and no one was sure if the Republic would actually sink at this early stage. There was genuine hope that the jewel of the White Star Line's Boston service would stay afloat long enough to be towed to New York for repair. Bin's work proved how invaluable the Marconi wireless system would be for maritime safety very quickly. His messages had been intercepted and amplified for hundreds of miles, and now multiple ships had altered their course to come to Republic's aid. Her passengers were safe for the time being, if a little uncomfortable, but the race was on to tow the Republic back to safety. Vessels were steaming in her direction irrespective of their owner, whether they were from a competitor as giant as Cunard or a small cutter operated by the government. Ships that heard those three letters, CQD, made their way to the approximate location of Republic in the fog. The RMS Baltic had been in the closing hours of another successful westbound journey when her captain, J.B. Ranson, altered her course to help her fellow White Star liner. She was over 60 miles from the Republic when the collision occurred, but she managed to locate the stricken liner and her passengers aboard the damaged Florida. Ranson was an experienced skipper. He'd been with the White Star Line since the 1890s. His position as Baltic's captain demonstrated the respect that Ranson commanded within the White Star Line because Baltic was the largest of the White Star's big four liners and was the largest ship in the world until the launch of the German liner SS Kaiserin Augusta Victoria. Despite being just over 60 miles away from the Republic at around 6 in the morning, Ranson had zigzagged Baltic through the foggy ocean for nearly 12 hours before he found the scene. A coordinated effort between the wireless operators aboard the Baltic and Binns on the Republic made the grueling task of locating what were two needles in essentially an enormous haystack far less strenuous. Rockets were also used as visual aids to help the ships locate each other. Captain Ranson estimated that he had snaked the seas between the location where he received Republic's distress signal and her actual position for approximately 200 miles. For the passengers aboard the Baltic, the situation was exciting. Certainly, their arrival into New York Harbor would be delayed, but their ship would be the center of a great rescue attempt. What more could a wealthy New York socialite want to finish off a trip to Europe? Binns left his Marconi set to stand on the deck and listen for the Baltic. His persistence was rewarded around 7 p.m. when the larger White Star Line ship could be heard off in the distance. The Baltic had arrived. It's here that the next great feat of the rescue effort took place. An assessment of the condition of Florida was made by Captains Selby, Raspini, and Ranson. It was apparent to the three skippers that Florida's condition was far too precarious to return to New York with all of Republic's rescued passengers and crew, in addition to her original complement. The best course forward, it was assessed, was to move all the Florida's passengers and all of Republic's people over onto the Baltic. This presented a logistical challenge. The transfer of passengers wasn't going to be an easy task. There was something like 1,600 people to transfer over to Baltic in rickety wooden boats. All three of Baltic's classes were significantly below their capacity though, so there was plenty of room for all the excess. As preparations were made to start moving people, the crews of the three ships struggled to manage the frustrated crowd aboard Florida though. To the displeasure of Florida's steerage passengers, the Republic's first-class passengers were the first to be transferred over to the Baltic. Once Florida's probably understandably disgruntled people will calm down, the transfer process could begin in earnest. The conditions, though, were far from ideal. The transfer didn't begin until around 11:40 that evening. It was dark, and the transfers had to be made with the assistance of bright searchlights. After all those hours of waiting, the thick fog still hadn't lifted. Now the ocean had become noticeably choppy. Baltic and Florida were about a mile apart, so the transfers were going to be a Herculean effort on the part of the crew charged with actually rowing the small lifeboats between the two vessels. The New York Times reported the next day that the little boats tossed and pitched as they wended their way backward and forward between the two vessels. The boats could only take about 10 people at a time, with 10 crew members to row. As a result, the process of actually moving those 1,600 plus people was agonizingly slow. When the sun broke over the horizon on the morning of the 24th, there were still hundreds of passengers aboard the Florida. To make matters worse, the choppy waves had allowed the stricken ships to drift further away from Baltic. With no working lights and her fires out, Republic had once again disappeared into the mist. But still, the transfer work went on. By around 10 o'clock in the morning, the last of the passengers from Florida had been moved to Baltic. For Florida's passengers, they would soon begin their new lives in America. For Republics, they were about to return to the very place they had been leaving from without ever having reached their destination. Baltic slowly turned back towards America and made for New York City. Captain Raspini also turned his damaged ship towards the US and slowly limped the damaged Florida to safety and repairs. That just left Republic. With the Baltic and the Florida both making for New York, the skeleton crew aboard Republic were now truly alone, drifting about in the choppy waves with no way to adjust their course. It was obvious that Republic was slipping further and further into the icy North Atlantic, but it still remained to be seen whether she could stay afloat long enough to actually be saved. Selby had hoped that he could have his ship towed to safety. The best case scenario was that the ship could be towed back to New York, but even beaching her on the coast to be refloated or saved later was a preferable outcome to a watery grave. Throughout the grueling, cold hours that Republic had been bobbing out in the sea, Binns had remained at his post, hoping that the batteries of his Marconi set would keep it operational long enough for help to arrive. By the 24th, news of Republic's plight was well known. Newspapers in New York City had been covering the disaster for over 24 hours, and people were anticipating the arrival of the survivors. Just about everyone in the shipping world at the time knew that the Republic was in deep trouble, so help was on its way, regardless of whether the Marconi set was actually working or not. Where Binns' equipment was helpful in the latter stages of the disaster, though, was in alerting other ships to Republic's location. There was real hope that Republic could be saved. Shortly after the transfer of passengers from Florida to Baltic, Republic was finally, once again, located. The fog at last began to lift, and it was apparent that there were quite a few ships that had come to the aid of the foundering White Star vessel. The United States revenue cutter, Gresham, was employed to help tow the Grand Liner to shallow waters. Gresham was a small vessel, dwarfed by the grand scale of Republic. At just 205 feet long, she was primarily used by the US government to enforce customs law, but in spite of her diminutive size, she played a role far beyond her tonnage in trying to save the British liner. Obviously, the Gresham wasn't going to be able to tow and control the Republic on her own, so the 5,000-ton Furnesia of the British Anchor Line was positioned at Republic's stern to help steer. Assisting Gresham to tow was the United States Coast Guard Seneca. She was nicknamed a derelict destroyer, a small ship very similar to Gresham, which was tasked with sinking abandoned ships off the US coast. It's a little bit ironic then that she was in this instance actually trying to save one. With Republic under tow by Seneca and Gresham, it was decided that the best option was to try and beach the White Star liner on the shoals just off Nantucket. Captain Selby had surmised that the Republic was sinking faster than what he had first thought. Efforts to try and stem the flow of water into the ship's large hull were scuppered when it was discovered that the engine room was now completely underwater. There was simply no way to stop it spilling over the watertight bulkheads. With the small ships heaving Republic along, progress was agonizingly slow, just a couple of knots at best, but there was still a sense of hope brimming that Republic might just make it. By 8:30 that evening, everyone involved in the rescue operation began to realize it was a losing battle though. The Republic's hull was almost gone. Her superstructure was still just above the surface, but when water began spilling over her sides, the railings and onto her decks, there was little more that could be done. It would spill over into the promenade decks, through doors into the finery of the first-class spaces, pouring down through cargo hatches and seeping through vents. Commotion could be heard aboard the Gresham as the crew scrambled to drop their lines to the Republic in case it dragged them down with her. The remaining crew aboard the stricken White Star liner were evacuated over to the revenue cutter except for Captain Selby and his second officer Williams, who would remain with the Republic until the very last moments. As if in slow motion, Republic's bow began to rise out of the murky water. In a matter of minutes, it was all over. She'd clung on remarkably for nearly 40 hours after the accident, her crew fighting valiantly to get her to safety, but in the end the damage was simply too great. Republic, the pride of the White Star Line's Boston service, went down stern first. She was the largest ship to ever sink at the time. Captain Selby and Second Officer Williams were rescued in the moments before the ship's final plunge. They were found clinging to a grate on the Republic's superstructure, Selby visibly exhausted from his ordeal. He'd fought valiantly for his ship, his passengers and crew, but in the end, it still wasn't enough. Aboard Baltic, Captain Ranson had been quick to inform his employers at the White Star Line's New York offices of the successful evacuation of all of Republic's passengers and crew, save for those few who'd been killed in the initial impact. As Florida, Baltic, and the other rescue ships began entering New York Harbor, crowds waited in palpable anticipation. Florida was a grim sight as she limped into port on the 26th of January with the help of tugs. Her flags flew at half-mast, telling a story of lives lost. She had survived, and despite her twisted and downturned bow, she would be out for repairs for only 24 days. Ironically though, she would eventually sink after a collision with another Italian liner, the SS Caprera in 1917, and her wreck has never been found. Baltic arrived in New York on the 26th as well. While any of the White Star Line's big 4 ships could have made that trip from the rescue location to New York Harbor in just a matter of hours, the difficult conditions meant that the big liner's arrival was heavily delayed. Travellers who were hoping to be well on their way to a warmer Mediterranean winter, or visiting family and friends devastated by that natural disaster, were once again faced with the ever-changing skyline of early 20th century New York City. For the Republic's passengers, the same crowds who had waved them goodbye as they set sail for Europe were somberly welcoming them back. People waited to see if their family members ranked among the unfortunate few who'd been killed during the collision. For those who were rescued off Florida, their new lives awaited them after the trauma of the Messina earthquake. It must have been a huge relief to be welcomed by the green copper hues of Lady Liberty after the upheaval of their lives and their ship seemingly nearly sinking. Meanwhile, Captain Selby and Second Officer Williams arrived in New York to a hero's welcome. Crowds had gathered to welcome the Republic's commander into the city and celebrate his commitment to staying with his stricken vessel until the very end. Stories of his decisive actions and his calm demeanour in the face of unimaginably stressful circumstances circulated around the globe. Newspapers like the New York Times painted images of Selby gripping the Republic's helm as the relentless waves of the North Atlantic spilled over the bridge. Selby was motivated by the traditional belief that a ship's commander stayed with their vessel until the bitter end. As with Captain Smith on Titanic years later, this prevalent belief saw many ships' captains go down with their vessel. Maybe Selby was prepared to face the same fate that Smith would just 3 years later, but luckily he was plucked from the sea, soaked and exhausted, and the public recognised the selflessness in his actions. One thing Selby was not prepared for was the flurry of interest and admiration awaiting him in Manhattan. As he stepped back onto dry land at the White Star Line's pier, he was welcomed to the tune of For He's a Jolly Good Fellow by Republic's bugler. The swelling crowds called on Selby to make a speech, a request which he turned down pointedly. He was exhausted from his ordeal, and soon he'd be asked to make an account of his actions. The crowds might have seen him as a hero, but it was more important what the White Star Line and the Board of Trade thought of what had happened. Similarly, Jack Binns was celebrated by an eager crowd in New York. Celebrated as the man who'd saved the lives of thousands with his distress calls, he became known as CQD Binns. Despite the excitement that surrounded him though, he just wasn't as jubilant. Reports printed in the following days painted a picture of a traumatized man. He was said to be a nervous wreck and to cry like a baby at the thought of going to sea again. And really, who could blame him? In the early hours of the morning, he was almost killed in his cabin as the bow of another ship ploughed through it, and then having the responsibility of calling out into the fog in the hope that his passengers and crew could be saved after the ordeal of the collision. He was only 24 years old at the time, far too young for the levels of stress and recognition that now swarmed him against his will. Binns' celebrity went far beyond what he was comfortable with. CQD, Saved by Wireless, was an early film made about the actions of Binns aboard Republic in 1909. So incensed by the exploitation of his traumatic experience was Binns that he successfully mounted a lawsuit against the film's production company. Strangely, there was no official inquiry into the accident. Possibly it was because there was such a limited loss of life. In recent years, some people have even gone so far as to theorise that the real reason was because of the potential riches in the Republic's hold. Realistically, the loss of life was limited. Only one ship sank and the other was repaired quickly. The circumstances were clear. 2 ships met and collided in the fog, and after a successful rescue, one was too damaged to remain afloat. Maybe some questions could have been asked of Captain Raspini, for instance. Why didn't he also order to turn his ship to starboard? Now we'll probably never know. The loss of Republic, her cargo and passengers' luggage, was covered by the White Star Line and her maritime underwriters. In all, 3 passengers from Republic were killed and 3 crew members from Florida too. It seems incredible that, given the new technology used to coordinate the rescue and the actual loss of life, that no formal inquiry was made. There was some controversy surrounding the sinking. Captain Thomas Fenlon of the steamer City of Everett claimed that he had actually offered to help Selby and that his vessel would have been able to pump enough water out of Republic to save her. Captain Fenlon also suggested he actually would have been able to tow the Great White Star liner with far greater speed than the US Coast Guard's ships, but the White Star Line declined and sent their own tugs, presumably so they wouldn't have to share the salvage money. Despite being disgruntled by this lack of involvement, Captain Fenlon's claims were basically overshadowed by the general excitement of the event. Selby, meanwhile, was found to have not been at fault in the sinking. However, he was released from his duties with the White Star Line. He'd go on to become a prominent American maritime lawyer and remained heavily involved in shipping for the rest of his life. Before returning to his home in England, Jack Binns spoke of the need for all ships to be fitted with a wireless system for safety in front of the United States Congress. His pleas were largely ignored by lawmakers, and it would be a number of years yet before American-flagged ships would need to carry a wireless set. Binns would remain with the Marconi Company until 1912, serving on various British ships before turning down a position on Titanic for that ship's maiden voyage. Instead, he later became a journalist, and he didn't have to face the distressing realities of seeking help for a sinking ship ever again. The location of Republic's wreck was unknown until 1981, when it was discovered by treasure hunter Martin Bayerly. She lies in 270 feet of water, approximately 50 miles off the coast of Nantucket. Since her discovery, there have been attempts to retrieve the rumoured gold from her hull. Nothing other than ordinary artefacts have been recovered. This has not stemmed the interest in Republic, though. The History Channel series, Billion Dollar Wreck, centres on the attempts to salvage the ship's supposed riches. But despite the best efforts of Bayerly and his team, there has never been any gold found within the ship's holds, nor has the existence of treasure aboard the Republic ever actually been confirmed. But the sinking of the Republic had far wider-ranging impacts than simply acting as the inspiration for treasure hunters. The successful evacuation of both Florida and Republic with such limited loss of life lulled ship operators and passengers into a false sense of security. The idea that lifeboats existed only to ferry passengers to safety on another liner had been proven on that fateful morning. Binns had demonstrated how the wireless would help alert other vessels in busy shipping lanes to the cause. As we know, when Titanic sank, she wasn't carrying anywhere near enough lifeboats for everyone aboard the ship. What's kind of shocking, though, is that Titanic actually carried more lifeboats than what was required by law. It was assumed that if Titanic got into any trouble, there would be other ships nearby to take her passengers before she went down like Republic had. The sinking of the RMS Republic had shown that a fatally wounded ship could easily stay afloat long enough after being struck to call for help with the Marconi wireless and await a rescue. But that leads us to this question: what if the conditions of the Republic disaster had been different? What if Florida had struck Republic in a different spot or with greater speed? If Florida foundered after ramming Republic, and she had to take on Florida's passengers and she sunk as well, the loss of life would have been far greater. That might have dramatically changed the response to the disaster. You wonder if legislative changes might have been made before Titanic ever set sail, but that's not how it happened. Sadly, the wrong lessons were seemingly demonstrated and then learned. The reality is that when Titanic struck an iceberg on the night of April 14th, an ongoing coal strike had dramatically reduced the number of ships at sea. There were no vessels close enough to her position to ferry Titanic's passengers over. Just under 1,500 people died in the sinking of Titanic. There were no ships close enough to respond to the Marconi distress signal, and unlike Republic, Titanic, which was significantly bigger, sank in over 2 hours. The unique circumstances that surrounded the Republic and Florida's accident had the effect of creating a false sense of security surrounding ocean travel. Now, it seemed, at last, mankind had conquered the ocean, that technology would save ships. It wasn't the case. Moving from one place to another has always been one of the most dangerous activities that humans can do. And in spite of continual advances in safety, processes and technology, we need to remember that there always remains a risk, no matter how small, and complacency kills. The story of Republic is really a triumph, but it's testament to the fact that we need to examine events and learn the correct lessons. Otherwise, things can get far, far worse.